Well, to echo what Joe said and also what Bill said, I've worked with a number of people over my storied 40 plus year career. But the one that stands above the others by a little bit is somebody who I started with when I began on radio back in the late 70s, early 80s, late 70s actually. And the gentleman's name is Sherm Strickhauser. He was billed back then as the um, veteran or the Southern New England's longtime talk show host. And I had the privilege of working on Sherm's show on WHJJ in Providence, Rhode Island. Did 3 or 4 hits a morning with him. As you can see, Sherm was a big guy, and he also had a big laugh as well. And typically, in the beginning, he would call up. I would answer the phone and get ready to do the broadcast on the air with him. And we'd tell stories, and I would tell a few jokes, and he had that big booming laugh. But then when we went on the air, I played it serious. I played it straight. I read the forecast and did what I thought was to be done, and then threw it back to Sherm, and that was it. 2 or 3 weeks into this, got a phone call from the program director at WHJJ, and Sherm was in the same room with him. He was on speakerphone. And he said, "We want to make a change here with the morning weather." And I said to myself, "What did I do? Did I offend somebody, or did I offend Sherm or whatever?" And that's when Sherm came in and said, "I'm going to talk to you like a Dutch uncle." He said, "I want the guy who I talk with before we go on the air, the guy who is personable, the guy who tells jokes, the guy who is very funny and witty. The guy I do the weather with is just a talking head. Can you possibly?" And I learned something from that. And Sherm said, "You know, morning drive radio is habit. And when people get into the habit of listening to you each morning, and if it's something that they like, they're going to come back to you and they're going to listen over and over again." He said, "I think you have that potential." He said, "So I want you to stop doing it, playing it straight. I want you to be the guy who I speak to before we go on the air, the funny guy, the witty guy." And so that's what I did. Slowly but surely, that's how I started to evolve as a weathercaster on radio. And the most interesting thing of all is one day there was hardly anything to talk about. And Sherm said, "She said, anything else you want to talk about?" And we had a calendar on the wall, a word of the day calendar. You probably have seen this, where each day there was a word and it gave you the definition of the word. And I said, "Oh, well, you want the word of the day?" And I gave him the word, and Sherm was able to give me the definition. And so from then on, every day at like the 8:30 time frame, he said, "All right, so what's the word today?" To get and what this evolved into, Sherm was well known in the Providence and Southern New England as a talk show host. He had the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, play the word of the day game. He had the governor one day was in the studio with him. He said, "Joe Ray is going to give you the word. See if you can find it." And so, I mean, and eventually that word of the day ended up being sponsored, for God's sake, by WHJJ. People, they actually got a sponsor to pay for that. So it wasn't they weren't paying for the weather; they were paying for the word of the day. Another time, we used to have something called the Night Owl, a train that went from Boston to New York in the pre-dawn hours, and it was delayed one morning. And just off the top of my head, I said, those wires that hang from above the train that provide the electricity, what do you call that? And Sherm said, "Well, I don't know, but we'll talk more about that later. Thanks a lot, Joe." 5 minutes later, Sherm calls me back, and he yelled. I said, "Hello, Weather Center." He said, "Pantograph, pantograph." He said, "Are you satisfied?" The whole switchboard lit up from people calling in to say what those wires were. And another time, we had Sergeant Slaughter, the WWF wrestling champion or whatever, and like when he threw it to me, Joe, say hello to Sergeant Slaughter. I just said, "All right, Sarge, I'm challenging you right now here in Providence, Rhode Island. I want to face you, Sarge." And Sarge played along, and he said, "All right, Ray, on it." And these were the things that we did. And eventually I became known on air with Sherm as Crazy Joe Rayo. But it worked. It worked, and I learned to use that in later on in other radio weathercasts and also on television. Sherm taught me a lesson. Don't be wooden. Don't just stand there and give the weather and go out. You got to show some personality. And if you show personality and you show that you're witty and you're happy and you work and whatever, you'll last a long time. Well, that was over 40 years ago. And sadly, Sherm passed away back in 1992. He had a stroke. As you saw before, he was a big man. He loved to smoke a lot. He loved to drink a lot, and unfortunately, that eventually worked against him, and he had a stroke. And he very shortly thereafter he passed away. One of the great regrets of my life is we never had a chance to meet face to face. But for 10 years, Sherm was my pseudo uncle. He always gave me good advice on a variety of different topics. If anything was eating me one morning, he would sit and he'd talk to me about it. And but he was great. And again, if it wasn't for Sherm giving me that advice and telling me flat out, you got to be personable on radio. You just can't read the weather. You can't act like Mr. Science. You got to make people like you. That was what eventually melded me into my career as a lady in radio, and then later on as television. And I owe so much to him. And I, again, out of all the people I work with, and I work with a lot of great voices on radio: Dan Ingram, Bob Grant, Barry Gray, Barry Farber, all of these legendary voices. The one that stands above all of them was Sherm Strickauser.